Good evening, everyone. It's the 13th of April, 2020, and we're just about to kick off the first ever online version of the Inside Story. This usually happens at a live event, different locations around the world. However, today, with these unprecedented times, we're going to be kicking off the Inside Story episode 2 online. So we're looking forward to having this conversation. We just want to thank everyone who's joined us so far. It's a bit of a different setup than usual, but we're really excited to have so many people tuning in from all around the world. So feel free during the evening to comment in the chat. But please, could you make sure you're commenting to all panelists and to all attendees? That would be amazing. So then we can all see some of the questions coming in. Alternatively, during the evening, we're going to be having a live Q&A towards the end of the evening, the end of the conversation. And it would be fantastic if you could use the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, to ask any questions that you would like to pose the panelists and myself. Great. Well, without further ado, I would like to just introduce the panelists and our guests this evening. Firstly, and by no means in any particular order, I'd like to just welcome the friends of ours from the UK, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie and Dr. Max Baker-Hytch, who are going to be conversing with us from the side of as theists and giving some evidence for the resurrection. And I'd like to also welcome our very good friends Paulogia and Harry Amos from the Book of Amos to be joining us in conversation as we look at this compelling question that is really a big question in life. That's what this whole show is about. It's about looking at the big questions, and this certainly is a controversial and a critical question that I think is really really important to look at. So we're really blessed and happy to have you guys on the show this evening, all of you, and I'm really looking forward to digging into some of this conversation. Cool. Before we do kick off, it'd be great if you could just introduce yourselves in terms of just where you're calling in from. That would be great just for our viewers, just so they can understand where you are in the world, and then we will. I'll then kick off with some introductions for you all. So, Jonathan, Dr. McLatchie, would you like to start off?
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, I'm British, but I currently live here in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States, and I'm a professor of biology at Sattler College in Boston, which is a Christian college. So I did my PhD, which I completed recently, in evolutionary biology, and I'm currently also working on a Master of Arts program in biblical studies at Southern Evangelical Seminary as well.
Thank you. I will do a further introduction to all of you in a second. So just location at the moment, which would be great. Dr. Baker-Hytch.
Yep. So I'm here, based in Oxford.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Paulogia.
Normally I go by Apologia, but it doesn't really matter because you can all call me Paul, which is great.
Forgive me.
In
Canada,
where it is snowing today. I also wanted to compliment you on the name of your show. If you had thought of the name of your show after the virus had hit, the Inside Story is like entirely apt. It's great.
Thank you very much. That is a conversation we can continue maybe off the chat. And Mr. Amos.
Hi, Harry from the Book of Amos, calling from London.
Fantastic, guys. Thank you so much for those introductions. I'm just going to now just share a bit of information on some of our guests, just in that same order, just so you viewers can have a good background as to who we have speaking and joining with us today. We're truly honored to have people who are really, as I said, all around the world, but also have looked seriously at this question. And that's what this show is about. As I mentioned before, it's about looking at these compelling conversations and looking at these questions that a lot of people are asking. So we're excited to have you guys with us. And I'll just now introduce in order of those people who spoke a minute ago. So Dr. Jonathan McLatchie is a professor of biology at Sattler College in Boston, Massachusetts. He has participated in more than 30 moderated debates and has lectured at venues across Europe, North America, and South Africa, promoting an intelligent, rational, and evidence-based Christian faith. He's also the founder of the Apologetics Academy, a ministry that seeks to equip Christians and challenge skeptics with the evidence for the truth of the gospel. And Jonathan will be, as you can imagine, arguing for the case of the resurrection, as I mentioned. Dr. Max Baker-Hytch received his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University in 2014. He's a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University, and is a member of the philosophy faculty at Oxford University. He's also a teacher and lecturer at the Oxford Centre of Christian Apologetics. Max has also published scholarly articles on various topics within the philosophy of religion and is currently working on a book on divine hiddenness. So moving on to our friends arguing against the evidence for the resurrection, I'd like to introduce Harry Amos. He's a graduate in philosophy, politics and economics from the University of Warwick. During his studies, his passion for investigating and analysing biblical texts, particularly the historicity of key events like the Exodus, conquest and Eastern narratives, led him to reconsider his Christian faith. Having personally found reconciliation between history and evangelical Christianity impossible, he now blogs on such topics at thebookofamos.com. The aim of this is to provide brief yet insightful and original contributions that enable open, respectful dialogue across differing beliefs and backgrounds. Paulogia is based over in Canada, as we've mentioned. Basically, after decades of devout belief and church ministry, Paul set out to affirm the foundations of his Christian faith for himself. To his surprise and dismay, he found the evidence for God, creation, and the resurrection to be woefully insufficient, and his faith fell away. Since 2017, his YouTube channel, Paulogia, has examined the claims of Christians from the perspective of one who still empathizes with those who believe. So I hope that gives you guys a brief summary to our guest tonight. It's an honor to have you guys with us, and I just want to stress again to those who've just joined us on the Zoom call, welcome. We're honored to have you guys with us, and we're looking forward to a really good balanced conversation this evening. And so, as I mentioned before, for those who've just joined, we're going to be taking questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if we could put all questions through there, that would be great. Also, alternatively, if you have any other questions for myself or some of the panelists, you can put it in the chat, but please do put it to all the panelists so that we can see that. Great. Well, without further ado, I would like to just find out a bit more about our guests before we start the conversation for proper. So for the viewers, I'd like I'm going to ask each one of you guys if you could maybe just share. So for Dr. McLatchie and Dr. Baker-Hytch, if you could share why you believe fundamentally in the resurrection, why you think that what made you come to your standpoint as it is right now, and then I'll be asking Paulogia and Harry as well, just as to the opposite question as to what made them, having been committed Christians, as they shared a minute ago, what made them change their mind as a kind of brief snapshot, not as a long conversation, because I know we're going to probably delve into some of those topics, but just as a top level soundbite for our viewers, that'd be great, just so we can get a good understanding before we kick off the conversation. So Dr. McLatchie, if you could start off, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So I'm a hardcore evidentialist. I'm a Christian because I'm persuaded by the public evidence that Christianity is objectively true. The evidences for the resurrection would be among the chief of those. I think that there's tremendous evidence for the veracity of the claims concerning the appearances to Jesus after he died and was buried. So one of the evidences for that, for example, would be the creedal tradition that Paul passes on in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, where Paul says, writing to the Corinthian church from Ephesus in the mid-50s AD, he says, what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ Jesus died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still living, some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one untimely born. Many scholars believe that to be an early creedal tradition that Paul's not come up with himself, but he's actually passing on. And many scholars believe that he received this creed likely from James and Peter upon his visit to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, as recounted in Galatians chapter 1. Even aside from that, though, I think we can still make a very strong case that even if the majority of scholars are wrong on that view, I think we can still make a very compelling case that what Paul says here reflects the beliefs of the early apostolic community. So notice what Paul goes on to say subsequently. He says, "For I am the least of the apostles, not even worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am. This grace towards me was not in vain. For in the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached, and so we believed. And so Paul seems to assume that his preaching is of the cross, burial, and resurrection of Christ is consistent with what's already been proclaimed by the eldership of the Jerusalem church. And we have independent confirmation that Peter had the Corinthians were acquainted with Peter's preaching, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul chides the Corinthian Christians for having divisions and factions in their midst. Some say, I follow Cephas, others Apollos, others I follow Paul, others I follow Christ. And so that, I think, is strong evidence. And so I'll just conclude with this. I think there are 4 contending hypotheses, which I would maintain are mutually exhaustive, which purport to explain the resurrection evidence. One is that the disciples never, in fact, claimed Jesus rose from the dead. I think the evidence I just went over, as well as many other pieces of evidence, eliminate that hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that the disciples did claim it, but they lied about it, deliberate deception. And there's numerous evidences against that we can get into. One evidence against that is that they were willing to suffer and die as martyrs for their testimony that Christ was risen, and liars make poor martyrs. So that would argue against the hypothesis that they were deliberately lying. Then there's the hypothesis that they were honestly mistaken. I think there's various lines of evidence against that, chief among which would be the fact that the resurrection experiences reported by the Gospels are polymodal in character, involving multiple sensory modes, not just sight, but group conversations, physical contact, eating breakfast with, and so forth, and extended across 40 days, according to Acts 1. So it wasn't a brief and confusing episode. And so then I think the best explanation then is that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, and that explains the evidence best, I think. So I'll finish with that.
Thanks, Jonathan. Dr. Baker-Hytch, if you could give us a brief overview of your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I maybe I'll save the sort of arguments per se for after this bit, but I can just give you a brief sketch of why I end up where I do now. So, I mean, yeah, I wasn't a Christian until about the age of 20. I wasn't sort of a strong atheist either, but I was fairly agnostic. And I suppose, yeah, what changed my mind was, without going into too much detail, encountering serious philosophical arguments for theism in a way that I thought didn't exist. I mean, I thought that sort of Bertrand Russell and A.J. Ayer had the last word on all that, but actually, the number of very respected Christian philosophers in the profession today took me by surprise. And I think I was surprised by the strength of the philosophical case for theism. But at the same time, I think I also started to look into the historical evidence. Of course, we'll get into that much more shortly. But again, there, I think, I mean, I'd had a sort of very loosely Anglican upbringing with a bit of Sunday school thrown in. So by my teenage years, I was not really a Christian in any sense. And I suppose I assumed, probably like most people in the UK who've never sort of looked into it, I assumed that the stories about Jesus were sort of, fables, mythology buried in the distant past. And so, yeah, coming across, encountering the fact that actually even scholars who, are not Christians, just for example, someone like E.P. Sanders, extremely respected figure in the field, held professorships at Oxford and Duke, one of the leading figures in the field of historical Jesus, makes it very clear in the introduction of his book that there's quite a long list of facts actually about Jesus that are basically beyond dispute, including, of course, that he was crucified, but actually many other things besides that. Including a number of the sorts of things he said and did, and so on. And so I think that all of that kind of thing really took me by surprise. I had assumed that there was really nothing there, not even sure whether Jesus really existed, but actually to learn that there's this very serious body of scholarship that points to a solid core of things that Jesus said and did. And of course, the resurrection, the events surrounding Jesus' death and the aftermath of that being particularly important. And But obviously, I don't want to anticipate too much what we'll get into in a minute.
Thanks, Max. Paulogia, would you give us a bit of background to your thoughts?
Sure. So, I mean, we're coming out of Easter week, as you know, and I think every YouTube channel on the planet, including all the churches, since we're all locked in, all decided to do their evidences of resurrection videos last week. And I watched a whole lot of those, including Gary Habermas, Michael Conan, a lot of these type of fellows. And the thing is, as I'm listening to these over and over, the arguments kind of come down to a similar thing from my perspective. So just to give you my perspective where we're at. So I'm going to give two quick analogies. Apologies for those. I know Jonathan likes to argue from analogies though, so that's hopefully okay. Suppose my neighbor comes to me and says, you know, we have these giant reptilian footprints in my yard, and we have all these scorch marks on my house, and we have the scratches on my roof and a big indentation. You know, I really think that a dragon best explains these facts. And I would say, hey, well, can I come over and can I, before we talk about what best explains these facts, can we possibly verify these facts? And the neighbor says, no, you can't come over. We can't look at we can't look at any of this evidence. We can't show you that it exists. We just want to argue that these claims, we want to examine what is the best explanation for these claims. That's sort of, to me, where we get to, in that I don't accept a lot of the things that people like Max and Jonathan and a lot of those are trying to explain. So first, for me, you have to establish that these things actually happen before you can try and explain them. The second analogy, brief analogy I would give, is because this is the type of evidence that I tend to see, is someone telling me, you know what, I know you don't believe that Spider-Man exists and that he was, I don't know you believe that Spider-Man is a superhero that he could swing around, but you know what, let's talk about how Spider-Man really lived with his Aunt May. And I'm like, well, I don't believe in Spider-Man. Why am I accepting that he lives with Aunt May? Well, let's talk about how he worked at the Daily Planet, or the Daily Bugle. Where did he work? Whichever one. The newspaper he worked at with J. Jonah Jameson. Let's talk about how that's a fact. And I'm like, well, no, the source material that if I believed the source material, if I believed that he lived with Aunt May, and if I believed that he was a photographer in a newspaper, then I might actually just believe the superhero stuff. So I don't understand why people are lifting, for example, the analogy follows. I don't understand why we're accepting that Joseph of Arimathea put him in a tomb. If I accepted that, the evidence for that is I would accept that he was resurrected. If we accept that the women were the first people there at the tomb, why am I accepting that if I don't accept the narrative as a whole? Those are the kinds of lines of evidence. Thanks. And I would love to get into them, but that's how it sounds to me. It sounds like someone is trying to tell me that Peter Parker is good evidence of Spider-Man, but we can't evaluate whether Peter Parker exists. So that's where I'm at. Great.
Thanks so much, Paul, for sharing that. And Harry, if you could just share your thoughts, and then we'll kick off our first question.
Sure. So thanks everyone for sparing the time to listen to myself and three far more qualified people. So I guess a bit of background on me. Until very recently, was a very committed Christian. I led a Christian union at college for 2 years. I participated in the UCCF Christian Union at the University of Warwick. I gave apologetics talks, even the occasional sermon at churches, and it was for me, history in particular, and the historicity of key events, as you mentioned, the Exodus, conquest, for two of them, but also, and most relevant to tonight, the Easter resurrection narratives that simply, upon further scrutiny, failed to hold sufficient weight for me anymore when I examined these things for myself, and I did so along a number of different lines. So I guess I'd like to quickly, if I may, make 3 points. So number one is, I think first we have to be very careful when we're coming at this, that we kind of think in the right way, like historians and as philosophers, as I'm sure Dr. Max will agree. Here, the burden of proof is not on Paul and myself. So we need to remember how extraordinary the resurrection claim actually is. So the prior probability, if we're thinking in a kind of Bayesian perspective here, as say William Lane Craig does, or many other apologists, it has to be regarded, prior probability is astronomically low. And I would say that on two counts. Number one is that Christ was buried in the first place, because as you know, two of the most qualified scholars from a Christian apologetics background, I'm sure we'll hear their names plenty tonight, and I'm sure the viewers will know them intimately very well, Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. They will readily acknowledge the most likely burial, or rather end of a crucifixion victim was a mass grave, or being left upon the cross for carrion, for dogs, and a rather grisly end, and that was kind of the point. And I can confirm that. I don't think it will be a point of contention too much tonight, that this was the majority end of most crucifixion victims. But I recently spent about a few months reading through 128 crucifixion narratives from the ancient world. I can guarantee that's the case. So it's extraordinary from a burial point of view. And additionally, that he was raised from the dead. And if you think about it, I guess, in this way, how many people have you known personally that have ever been raised from the dead? I know that's kind of a facetious question, but it makes, this is the only time in which anyone would claim the most likely explanation has definitely got to be that someone has been raised from the dead. It's not something that happens very often, and even those people that do think it happens, like yourselves, would claim that it only happened once. So it's very, very low, and the burden of proof is on the person making the claim here, and that would be the proponents tonight. We also need to be careful when we say, for example, the best possible explanation. We're talking about, there's a difference between a possible explanation and logically probable, which would be over 50%. It's more likely than not. And a best explanation, for example, there could be 19 explanations of the minimal facts, for example. The best of those, let's say it's 10% likely, and the other 18 explanations you would put 5% probability by. It would still make no sense to believe the best possible explanation. So we need to be careful with all these kind of methodological pieces, and I think we need to have a very good awareness of philosophy of history here. So I think we'll, and I'll make the last 2 points quite briefly because I'm aware of time.
Great, thanks.
But the accounts, we have many, many, many problems with these accounts. They are not independent. They don't agree on a number of key points that we would expect in a court of law if we're reliant on eyewitness testimony, and I don't for one think that eyewitness testimony is in the main what we have represented in the Gospels, but we don't have independence, we have interdependence, because 80% of Mark we're talking about having been reused in Luke and in Matthew. It represents a significant portion of their Gospels. So then we've also got the issue of when were they written, and then when of those documents, say if they were written in 70 AD, Mark's Gospel, for example, or Luke or Matthew, that leaves 40 years period for rumours, for legends to accrete, and then after that we have manuscripts coming from, in the main, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century manuscripts, hundreds of years for additions, subtractions to be made to these original texts that we don't possess. And then I know that I've said the burden of proof is not on Paul and myself. However, here we have frequently liar, lunatic, lord, or we have was it a conspiracy? And I think Paul and I are going to agree tonight, which makes it quite easy in a way for our intellectual opponents. We would both believe here that it's not liar, it's not lunatic, it's not Lord, it's not myth either. We do believe that Jesus was a historical person. The evidence points there. That's not in any form of debate here. No, for us, it's a legend. And the pattern of evidence from the earliest material to the latest material shows very clear legendary accretion and increasing levels of additions to the text. I will stop there, but I think those are kind of three angles that I would take upon the discussion tonight.
Thank you, Harry, Paul, Max, and Jonathan, for those not opening statements, because this isn't a debate, this is a conversation, as we've made very clear. Thank you so much for those thoughts as we start off. And we've just had our first three questions through, and I thought one of the questions is actually going to be very poignant to just setting the tone of this whole conversation just before we start off with anything. Just another note for those who have just joined us. It's great to have so many on the chat and also on the joining us this evening. For any conversation or questions, please use the chat at the bottom of the tab, and please address all questions to the panelists. And then throughout the evening, I'll be dispersing them, and then specifically towards our time of Q&A towards the end of the time. But the first question I'd like to just put out there, just for everyone, just to give a bit of an understanding too, would be, firstly, well, one of two questions actually. The first one would be, what would it take for you guys to kind of change your mind? And so I guess this applies to all of the guests on the panel. So very briefly, if we could just have a few words as to what it would take for you guys to change your mind both ways. And then we've got one final question before we go into some of the points from each side. So Dr. McLatchie, would you like to start?
Absolutely. So that's a bit like asking me what would it take to convince your mind that Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slaves? Well, the whole body of evidence would have to be significantly different if it were true that Abraham Lincoln did not emancipate the slaves, or that Julius Caesar did not cross the Rubicon, or something like that. So for me, you would have to remove all the evidence that confirms the resurrection. So that's what would change my mind if there wasn't sufficient evidence.
Thanks, Jonathan. Max?
Yeah, I mean, broadly similar answer to Jonathan, I suppose. Maybe I'd say if there was significant evidence that there was an account of what Jesus was like that was plausibly early and reliable, that painted a very different portrait of Jesus from the canonical Gospels.
Thanks, Max. And Paul?
I would actually give a very similar answer to Jonathan. If there was sufficient evidence for me to believe, obviously I would be convinced. The trick would be, I'm not convinced that any level of testimony actually could be sufficient to overcome, whether there can be miracles in history. But I'll just leave it at, I like to do this more at the end, but I probably think that if it would have to be something spiritual that Jesus would do, a personal experience, even though personal experience would be terrible evidence for anyone other than myself, it probably has to come to that for me.
Thanks, Paul. And Harry?
So I guess, yeah, personal evidence I would put less of an emphasis on, as Paul has alluded to, given that we know that psychological biases exist in all of us, and we eyewitness testimony, even in a court of law, has kind of much scrutiny that it needs to abide by, because we can frequently either deceive ourselves or just kind of convince ourselves that we're seeing things that we're not, per se. But I guess for me, it is the case of, as I said, prior probability of a crucifixion victim being buried, very, very, very low, 0.03%, according to the narratives that I read as part of looking at this issue. And then on top of that, anyone being raised from the dead. So the prior probability is low. So the specific evidence would have to be really, really astoundingly convincing. And I would add one further small point. Considering if Jesus was raised from the dead, if the hypothesis were true, we would accept things such as God is omnipotent. The God of Jesus is omnipotent and could provide sufficient evidence, and could do that very powerfully, then we have to ask ourselves, is the evidence anywhere near the bar necessary? And could God have made it, if the hypothesis were true, could he have made the evidence that we have surviving today anywhere near or well above that bar, considering that we all agree that the topic is very important. If you have an eternal conscious torment view of hell, for example, then I think Paul and I would agree we particularly don't want to experience that. Any sane person, I guess, would have that view. It would be handy if God could make sufficient evidence, and I believe if he's an omnipotent God that he could.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Well, that's very helpful, just for our viewers to understand where we're all starting from. Just one final question is coming from Andre, which I think is very poignant for this start of this conversation, and it's to all speakers. But I think if maybe we had one from either side, just give this some thought, that'd be great. What is your starting point when examining any evidence and making any truth claim? What is the foundation from which you distinguish truth from error, and could you be wrong? So those, if we could spend a bit of time just looking at that before we go into our kind of key points for this evening, that would be great. And maybe Max, you could start off from the resurrection point of view.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Could I be wrong? Yes, definitely. In terms of how I assess evidence, so I would approach this in terms of a Bayesian framework. So, I mean, Bayesianism tries to capture something fairly intuitive. And it does so with a mathematical model, but we don't need to use that to make the point. So the idea in general is if you have some hypothesis and you want to know whether that hypothesis is confirmed or made more likely by a given piece of evidence, you need to consider, basically you need to weigh two things. One is the prior probability of the evidence, of the hypothesis. That's to say, before you've thought about any evidence, how likely is it that this hypothesis would be true, just in general. And then the other thing is, how strongly does this evidence confirm the hypothesis? So that's a way we think about that is to say, well, how much more strongly would we expect this evidence if the hypothesis is true versus if the hypothesis is not true? So in the case of the resurrection, we can think about how strongly would we expect this evidence, whatever we say the evidence is, and of course we'll get more into that. How much would we expect that, given that Jesus rose from the dead, and compare that with how strongly would we expect that evidence, given that Jesus didn't rise? So I hope that's a useful sketch of how I'd approach it.
Thanks, Max, for that. And out of you two, Paul or Harry, would you like to come back on that? Maybe one of you two, is that right? You happy with that?
Which one do you want?
Yeah.
I mean, it depends entirely on the kind of claim. The question was a little bit vague. If we're talking about normal claims, normally what I would say is the truth is the extent to which a proposition conforms to reality, and we decide whether it conforms to reality by by its predictive power, whether it makes unique predictions. And so the trouble, of course, with historical claims is that we can predict. We attempt to predict future evidence that will be found. Which is the best way, obviously. Like, for example, with evolution, we predicted where and when Tiktaalik would be found, and sure enough, they go and found. For those of you who care about biology, that's a thing. So obviously, when we come to evidence, I would agree with the Bayesian general historical model that we're at this point in this conversation probably attempting to decide what is the best explanation for the facts in question. I think, unfortunately, we're going to disagree on what are the facts in questions and not whether the analysis of it makes sense or not.
Cool. Thanks for that. Those thoughts from both of you guys. We're going to start the conversation now, and we're going to look at a number of points from either side. But just before we do that, I'd just like to say again, anyone who's got questions, if they could be, if they want to tweet them, they can do that at The Real Inside Story on Twitter using that hashtag, or if they want to ask questions in the chat and the Q&A, please do so. We've got a number of questions already coming in, and we're looking forward to going through them towards the end of the conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to just ask Paul and Harry if they would like to share some of their first points. Maybe share one point, and then Jonathan and Max can come back at that, and then we'll go back and forward if that's all right with you guys. Harry and Paul, would you like to start off and go from there?
Would you like, Harry?
I'm very happy to kind of kick things off. So I guess, as I mentioned, I think that if you want to approach, and we've talked about the fact that we could be wrong here. We've talked a bit about Bayesian probability. We've talked about best possible explanation versus kind of what is probable and not probable, and kind of a 50% bar for that. I guess if we want to come to the accounts, we are talking about many problems here, and we're talking about a pattern of evidence that best fits, and so I don't really want, because apologists spend a lot of time talking about, for example, the conspiracy theory or the swoon theory, and I'm aware that there are a couple of voices that are kind of lone in the wilderness addressing these, but I think legend, Paul and I will both agree, is the most likely explanation of these facts that covers all of the facts that I think that we would agree on, and I know that there will be back and forth on which are to be considered facts and which are not.
Should we start by seeing which facts?
Yeah, I think that would be a very sensible way of doing things, particularly, I guess, given the burden of proof. I think it would probably be quite helpful if there was an outline of which facts which historical facts need explanation, and then we can get into where we would approach some of these claims. I think that's probably a more helpful way of doing things, perhaps.
That'd be great. Well, let's kick off with that.
Okay. So I am going to start by looking at some of the evidences for the post-resurrection appearances. My colleague Max is going to look at some of the evidences for the empty tomb. I already outlined the arguments from 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, that creedal tradition that Paul passes on, and I showed how it evidences, gives the window of insight into the beliefs of the early apostolic community, in particular the apostles, Peter and James and so forth. I think we can make independent evidence as well for the veracity of the appearances. So I think an even earlier source, actually, than the source in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, is to be found in the book of Acts and chapter number 2. When we read the testimony of Peter, when he says that Christ has been raised from the dead, and of this we're all witnesses, in his sermon at the time of Pentecost. And I think we can argue convincingly that this is a reliable report of the beliefs of Peter, even if it's not a verbatim tape recorder report, which I don't think it is. I think it encapsulates accurately the gist of what Peter proclaimed and what he believed. So in Acts 2, verses 29-32, Peter says, "Brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses." Now, the Apostle Paul had a traveling companion by the name of Luke, and he is the author of the book of Acts. And Luke, in the book of Acts, claims by his own testimony to be a traveling companion of Paul. And we can establish this from the use of the plural pronoun we from chapter 16 onwards, and we can discuss the significance of that if people wish. And this, I think, is confirmed by the evidences, including the way that the book of Acts intersects with the epistles of Paul, as well as intersects with extra biblical sources, including Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius and so forth. I think we can make a very powerful case that that certain elements and aspects of Luke's knowledge is best explained if indeed Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. And in particular, Luke was with Paul upon his visit to Jerusalem in Acts 21, where he meets with James and the Jerusalem leadership. And Luke was, of course, imprisoned along with Paul for 2 years in Caesarea, quite close to Jerusalem. And then he was with Paul on that fateful voyage spoken of in Acts 27 on the way to Rome, which ended in shipwreck. And if Luke was with Paul on that shipwreck voyage, then he presumably was with Paul as he claims to be in Acts 21.
Jonathan, just to make this more of a chit chat, so we're not, I've heard you give this kind of presentation before. Are you saying, I think what you're saying is one of the facts in play is that the disciples, what is the fact in play? That there were appearances, or that there was reported appearances?
Yeah, so this is an argument against the legend thesis. So the legend thesis would maintain, as I understand it, that the resurrection claim is something that developed much later. It's not something that originated with the original apostles.
Right.
Or would you?
Sorry to jump in. As an upholder of the legend hypothesis, and Paul may disagree, I don't know, I wouldn't be claiming that. I would claim that all you need, for example, is Paul to have had a very early experience of the risen Jesus, a visionary experience, a revelation. I don't believe that this is some kind of very late development in the early Jesus narrative. I do believe that this is authentically early. But I guess I would like to ask, if I may, so can I clarify, the earliest source for you, is it 1 Corinthians 15, or is it the speech in Acts 2? What would you regard the earliest source?
Sure, it's the speech in Acts, because Acts, according to the book of Acts, Peter gave this speech at Pentecost, which is some 50 days after the resurrection.
Sorry to jump in again, and I will promise not to do this very much. But in terms of this speech, so chronologically, the story narrative, this is the first speech regarding appearances. This isn't chronologically the first source, though, is it?
Correct. Right.
So the earliest source that we have, ignoring manuscript tradition, I wouldn't want to go into that yet, is this one in 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah, I mean, 1 Corinthians was written by Paul in Ephesus, and he was
About 50 AD, would you say?
Yeah, early to mid 50s, and most scholars are persuaded that in verses 3 through 7 in chapter 15, he is quoting from or passing on a creedal tradition, and there's a number of evidences for that. One is its rhythmic style; it's designed for ease of memorization. You've got the use of the Aramaic name Kephas for Peter, etc. And also in Galatians 1, he mentions meeting with Peter and James in Jerusalem, where many scholars believe that he received that creedal tradition. So the actual source in which that creedal tradition appears is written in the early to mid 50s AD, but he's quoting from an earlier source. And likewise in the book of Acts, I would maintain is written a little later than 1 Corinthians, around early 60s. I would place it, but it's passing on a speech that was proclaimed very close up to the crucifixion itself.
Okay, so I guess inevitably we'd disagree on the dating of Acts. I would put it far later, into 80s, 90s, but that isn't necessarily important. I think what I would say though is I agree with you, and it's always nice to start with an agreement, that this is almost certainly the earliest source that we have. I think that a number of scholars would disagree and say that this is perhaps a later interpolation into the text of 1 Corinthians. I don't think that's the case.
Who would say that, Harry? I don't know of a single credible textual scholar. I mean, Bart Ehrman thinks it's undoubtedly part of the original.
Yeah, so again...
No credible scholar thinks it's an interpolation, just to clarify. I think that's quite important. Okay,
I'm not going to get into that because that's not essential to my point, because I agree with both of you that that is not correct. I have seen that claimed though, but I can't be bothered to go into that. So in terms of...
all sorts of things get claimed.
True. So I would like to move on, if I may. The thing that I would like to point out here, however, is that in 1 Corinthians 15, we have a pattern of appearances. So we have what I received of first importance, I passed on to you. I'm quoting this from memory. I have a Bible next to me, but I'm not going to flick back and forth between it. He appeared first to Cephas, to Peter, and then to the 12, and then to me, i.e. to Paul, as one untimely born. So the first thing I would point out here is we have no mention of the women. There's no mention of the women at the tomb. And I think that we will inevitably discuss this, whether the women were the first witnesses or not, but clearly not according to Paul. The first appearance was to Peter, to Cephas, and then to the 12. And then after that, we have to, and again, this could be a contraction, but again, the narratives have discrepancies between, did Peter and John rush to the tomb and so forth regarding who saw what when. But then to Paul, and I think this is important, and he regards himself as an apostle, and one of the criteria for apostleship is kind of a personal revelation from Christ. For the appearance to Paul, he does mention that with appearances from Jesus, he doesn't know whether this was in the body or out of the body. We know that Paul falls into trances. He sees visions, for example, of a man of Macedonia. Some scholars have wondered if he had temporal lobe epilepsy, for example, or some other condition which might cause such visions. And I know that there are other thoughts that I'm sure Paul will touch on later, perhaps around post-traumatic kind of hallucinations or visions, on post-bereavement for the other apostles. But I think Paul classifies this as a revelation, as an appearance. So it's not at all clear that these are in the body. In our earlier source, we have no women. We have then appearance to Peter, to the 12, and then to Paul. And we don't have equally any clear evidence that this is an in the body, a physical revelation. And I think that's quite important. That this is our first source. And then we move on, for example, to Mark, who has an empty tomb with one man in kind of shining white clothes. We can assume perhaps this is an angel. I think that's fair. I think that's implied. We then have the women, and the women then are frightened by this. They say nothing to anyone because they were afraid, and there were no appearances. And again, I imagine we would agree that, but maybe we wouldn't. The long ending of Mark, I don't believe, is original to the gospel, and I don't think that perhaps for the debate tonight that almost that can be assumed, because I think Paul and I would completely disagree on that. Then we have Matthew. We have the resurrection of many holy people. We have Luke with a number of different appearances, including Emmaus. Then we have John with a number of miracles. And we have the doubting Thomas narrative. We can see quite clearly here a pattern, in my view. Again, we could talk about other things, but I do think that this is an important point, that we have a pattern emerging here from our earlier source, 1 Corinthians 15, through the Gospels with their chronological progression, and then through to the apocryphal Gospels, where there are huge embellishments, and I'm sure you would agree that they are credible sources. The Gospel of Peter with a walking, talking cross, for example, and I would recommend to anyone watching this. It's a very entertaining Gospel. I don't believe it contains any or much historical truth, but it's certainly a good read. I think I've talked quite a lot, but I do think Jonathan, this is a key debating point, and I'm sure Jonathan has much to say on it.
Jonathan, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I do. There was a lot there.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. So
you've had your slot there now, Harry. So,
so as for example, you mentioned no appearances in Mark 16. I think it's implied that there were appearances. It says, so the angel says to them, verse 6, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And so a lot of skeptics get hung up on this verse. It says they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment to see them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
Right, but Jonathan, like, that's the trouble. I'm hoping we can go back and forth a little bit more in the chat. You know, that's you're talking about an inference. The text doesn't actually say it, right? Like and so for someone like myself, it's well, the text doesn't actually say it. Yes, if you bring in what your preconceived idea of the story is, then sure, it doesn't contradict. But I don't think either Henry and I were
responding.
Can I just ask a question? Oh, sorry, Jonathan. Yeah, go.
Let me just finish, and then we can converse, because I didn't finish responding to the point. So it says they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, what's Mark's normal usage of that expression? So if you go to Mark chapter 1, where Jesus cleanses the leper, for example, he says, what does he say to the leper in verse 44? "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest." So in other words, say nothing to anyone on the way to going to present yourself to the priest. Now, Mark as we have it is broken off at Mark 16, verse 8. We can only really conjecture as to how it ended originally. The most plausible reading, I would argue, of the phrase, "said nothing to anyone," is that the woman did not run screaming into Jerusalem tell all what they'd seen to the first male that they met. Rather, they ran straight to the disciples without telling anyone else. In fact, if you look at Mark's usage elsewhere, Mark 5:37, for example, Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John. Mark 9, verse 8, suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. Mark 10, verse 18, Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." So I think it's quite plausible to understand it in that way.
Sure. The trouble for me is that I don't think that Mark is an eyewitness report of any kind, and that, that we're talking about something that was written 40 years after the events, and that it is basically a writing down of 40 years of growing legend. So
I would dispute your claim, first of all, that it was written 40 years after the event. I would date Mark much earlier, but be that as it may.
Okay, let's call it 30 or 20, whatever you want to call it.
It's immaterial to this subject, because I don't think it matters terribly much. And I don't think the evidence for any conclusion is conclusive. But that what you say, that Mark is you don't believe Mark's an eyewitness account. Well, sure, but that's immaterial to the alleged point, because the point that was being made was that Mark has no resurrection appearances. And I said that based upon the way that Mark usually uses that expression, and also the implication in Mark 16 that there were, because the angels tell the woman to go and tell the disciples that Jesus will be meeting with them, that suggests that there were in fact resurrection appearances, even though the ending of Mark has been broken off and we have to conjecture.
But I think what we can fairly say, though, is that even if we grant that, so that you can read the text very carefully and with all of the context, and then infer that there were appearances in it, that they are of lesser quality than the appearances in the later books, that there is a progression of that these are inferred appearances in Mark, and by the time you get to the apocryphal gospels, we're having these massive things.
There's an inconsistency, though, because first you've conceded that 1 Corinthians 15 is an earlier source, and 1 Corinthians 15 has an appearance to 500. So,
this is why I was trying to ask earlier. You're granting that people believed this. Like, a creed to me isn't a source. A creed is telling me what people at that time believed. Like, Paul didn't make up the creed.
Max, do you want to jump in there? Did you have
I feel like it would be helpful if we almost kind of agreed on, or managed to get clear on what it is that we agree on. So, I assume we take it for granted Jesus was crucified. I also get the impression from you too that the burial and empty tomb are very much not things that you two grant. So it could make sense for us to discuss that. The thing I'm not quite clear on at the present point is to what degree the both of you think that the disciples sincerely thought, whether they were right or wrong, and obviously you think they were wrong, but that they sincerely thought that they saw Jesus alive again, which is obvious. I mean, that's the thing that is, often called a minimal fact, in the sense that even an atheist scholar like Gerd Ludemann will say it's historically certain that Peter and the 12 thought that. So do you guys grant that they thought that Jesus appeared to them?
I'm going to jump in, sorry, because my view is a little bit unique on this, although I'm finding more and more people are agreeing with me. I accept that Peter and Paul both believed their stories. I don't think we have evidence for any individual other than Peter and Paul who believed their stories. So I accept that those two were relaying something they actually believed.
So what about the 12?
I see no. Do we have any records of anyone, any of the 12, saying, my name is Bartholomew, I saw Jesus risen. My name is Matthew, I saw Jesus written. My name is any of them. I don't think the 12 basically disappear from history. And I'm not even sure, the names of the various lists of the apostles don't even match, although I know that's harmonized, so I shouldn't bring it up.
So, I mean,
I don't.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that you would agree that's a minority position.
No, the trouble is people say disciples, people say apostles, but then when I press them on what they mean, they come down to, well, I guess we have evidence for these two, but we like to use this broad name of the 12. We like to use the broad name of the disciples.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's extremely implausible. I mean, and I think, mainstream scholars, including atheists and agnostics, generally do think that it wasn't just Peter and Paul. I mean, for one thing, so given the extreme earliness of the 1 Corinthians 15 summary, which I think you both grant, I mean, we could quibble about exactly how early, but pretty early. I mean, the 12 were a group who existed. I think that much should be uncontroversial. And so for Paul to be passing on this creed to the Corinthians at a time that they could quite happily go up to Jerusalem and talk to these people, to posit that this claimed appearance to the 12 is just sort of fictional, I think is quite implausible.
Well, that's unfortunately we're coming down to what's plausible or not. We don't have, even in Galatians, he doesn't list that he went to visit all the 12. In Galatians, he visited Cephas, right?
Sure, he visited Cephas, who was the spokesman for the 12.
Right. Well,
I mean, are you saying the 12 didn't exist? I mean,
no, the 12 existed. I think the 12 probably existed, and they scattered to history after the crucifixion. Because that's really the reliable sources we have don't give us any hint of any of the other beyond Peter
and James, right?
James the brother, or James?
James the brother of Jesus. I mean,
but he wasn't one of the 12, right?
Well, but he was a witness to the resurrection, so I don't see what relevance it has to your point.
Well, but was he?
Well, so 1 Corinthians 15 specifically mentions that Jesus...
I understand 1 Corinthians, but then I would grant the 500 as well, and I don't.
And we know that Paul was personally acquainted with James because he meets with him in Galatians 1.
And do we, in any of those, does James affirm?
In 1 Corinthians 15, that's what Paul represents James's belief as being.
Okay. This is this weird creed that it's like, well, if I met Humpty Dumpty, would I say Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses and all his men couldn't hunt together again, or would I relay Humpty Dumpty's story? Like in Galatians, Paul says, and I'm sorry, I'm really monopolizing time, and I will be quiet soon. He talks about these men added nothing to my message, which for someone like, you can read it as, oh, we all agreed. But in the very next section, we know they had a very big disagreement. So Paul may well be saying, I didn't listen to anything these guys said. I guess for me, the creed is part of the legend. And it doesn't matter if it happened only 2 years before. I don't think the 500 saw Jesus. I don't think the 12 saw Jesus.
I mean, when Sorry, Paul, did you want to, I didn't want to cut you off. Did you?
No. I feel like I've spoken a lot, so I'm going to sit quiet for a minute.
Well, I mean, in terms of the 500, I'll just say something briefly, and then I don't know if Jonathan or Harry want to come in. But in terms of the 500, I mean, Paul is quite explicitly saying some of them are still alive. I mean, so if you think that this is totally fictional, then what on earth is going on there? Paul's saying, in that, in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 7, it says 500 brothers and sisters at once, some of who are still alive, some have died. This is the 50s AD in Corinth. The Corinthians.
Well, some people put that as part of the original creed.
Well, I don't think it really matters actually whether it's. I mean, it's Paul's. It's Paul. Right. I think we all agree that it's coming from Paul, and Paul knows people in Jerusalem. And he's saying to the Corinthians quite explicitly, you can go and talk to some of these people.
Yeah, how would that work though? Like, I've never been able to figure this out. How would that work? So you don't live anywhere near Jerusalem. There are 500 people in Jerusalem 20 years ago who said they saw a thing. Well, check it out.
Well, Jews went up to Passover to Jerusalem. Male Jews were supposed to try to go up to Jerusalem for Passover if they could.
Yeah, and so you go to Jerusalem and you start asking around which of the 500, and we're supposed to suppose also that even if they found someone like that people wouldn't make up. Oh yeah, like for example, the Woodstock, concert. There are hundreds of thousands of people who said they were there, even though there's only a few thousand people who were there. Is a studied thing. He couldn't, if he said go check my work, means that the work is fine. That's not the way this stuff happens. The fact that you can say that my work can be checked doesn't mean that the work was checked or could reasonably be checked.
So
also, sorry, I want to wait. Yeah, I'm being very rude, and I apologize.
Please, I've spoken too long.
Don't apologize, Harry. Go for it.
Corinthians, was it written to Jews or Gentiles?
A mixture.
Okay, and I asked that as a genuine question. I'm not.
Yeah, no, that's a fair question.
There are some things I don't know, so I can't claim to be an expert necessarily on the letters of Paul and to whom each of them is addressed. So a mixture. So at least then half the audience, presumably, won't be heading. And given that Paul emphasizes that the law is not essential to his message. He's not going to be encouraging the Gentile Christians to necessarily head to Jerusalem to check these things out.
Yeah, I mean, so I think all that's necessary for the point I was making is that there were people in the church in Corinth who were Jewish. I mean, that much is clear from some of the names. But we also know there was a synagogue in Corinth, and Paul always started off his missionary activity there. I mean, all that's necessary for the point really is that there were some people in the church in Corinth who would have the inclination and capability of going up to Jerusalem. Yeah.
And I just normally say, it's human nature that false stories spread, even if there are people around to correct them. That's not an unusual thing.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I guess maybe we were trying to establish what we agree on, and maybe it's helpful just to come back to that. So I mean, Paul, you're saying you think only Peter and Paul genuinely thought that Jesus appeared to them.
I feel like all the evidence that I've heard, now I'd love to learn more, but all the evidence I've seen matches that hypothesis.
Yeah, and is that your position as well, Harry?
I wouldn't get hung up on it. I think definitely we have the quality of evidence for Peter and Paul is already not necessarily where we want it to be. The quality of evidence for the 12, where do they go in history? In the book of Acts, we only hear really about Peter and the 12. The 12 are never distinguished as to who they are, what they then go on and do. I think that we also need, I know we'll have probably a bit of discussion on whether or not the apostles went to their deaths or whether they were willing to die and what the evidence there is. But certainly the evidence for the rest of the 12 besides Peter and Paul is abysmal, and that's, you know, being generous to Peter and Paul there as well. I'm kind of siding with Paul here. The more that I think about it, the more that my mind starts to agree with Paul. But again, like, you know, both of us are open. Feel free to suggest evidence on that point, because I know that Jonathan, you wanted to cover the appearances, and Max, you wanted to cover the empty tomb.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.
So when you said that the evidence for Peter and Paul is, I think the word you used was abysmal, what did you mean by that? Did you mean, what did you mean by the evidence for Peter and Paul?
So sorry, I wasn't very precise there. So when I say that, I mean for whether they died or was whether they were willing to die, it isn't already, there's an evidence challenge here. I don't think that they're sufficient, but the evidence for the 12 is even less. And that was what I think, you know, I will check the recording, but so the evidence for the 12 is abysmal. Yeah. The evidence for Peter and Paul is insufficient.
Okay, I mean, in terms of the evidence for Peter and Paul, I would say that it's really strong that they were willing to suffer and die, and that both of them actually did die as martyrs. So you're familiar with Paul's own testimony to his suffering in 2 Corinthians 11.
Suffering, yes. Die is a different question, I think.
I mean,
suffer is like, nobody would question that. Paul regularly says how much he's suffering, and I don't doubt him.
Yeah, and it seems from reading just the laundry list of the number of sufferings that he endured as a result of being an apostle that he lists in 2 Corinthians 11, and also the testimony in the book of Acts, and also his testimony in 2 Timothy. It suggests, I think, strongly that he was willing to suffer, which is really all you need to show that he was at least sincere. And we have Clement of Rome in the 1st century, who was a companion of Paul, who was a 1st century writer, leader of the Corinthian church, and he mentions Peter and Paul's martyrdom in chapter 5 of 1 Clement.
Right. So to Max's point, I think this is something we'd all agree to, that Paul was willing to suffer. I think that would be an agreement point.
And you would agree that Clement says that they were martyred, right?
I would agree that Clement said that they were martyred, and that's actually in a way I agree that. So for me, the definition of martyr is very loose. What I would like to see when it comes down to no one would die for a lie, I would like to see the fact that they, first of all, said that they were witnesses, and we only have one such person. Second, that they were given a chance to recant, but passed it up.
Okay.
Sorry,
I didn't mean to interrupt.
I had a third thing, but I lost it, so I'll leave it there.
You're also aware that there's also, in addition to Clement, there's also an additional 1st century source which documents the martyrdom of Peter, and that is the Gospel of John, chapter 21. Because if you look at John,
that's he got led to where he's eventually going to go. Like that, I don't know.
Yeah,
that's not impressive.
So in John chapter 21, he speaks. He says. He says that, verse 18, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you were old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God.
Right, but so I have a grandparent who passed away, and that could be an apt description of the way they died. Like but
it says specifically this he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God, which is language that suggests martyrdom quite strongly.
Right, and that's actually partially why I think we would agree that we think that these, like John was written probably at least after 70. So I don't disagree that John was written after Peter died, and that this could well be some kind of description. And this is partially why, martyrdom of we say that martyrdom of Peter and Paul are slightly better. And this is partially why I grant that Peter and Paul were the two that we have relative evidence that they were sincere. So the question is, was anyone else sincere? And do we have any evidence that, beyond Peter and Paul of sincerity and what's going on?
So what about the martyrdom of James? So we have a 1st century source concerning that towards the end of the 1st century, which is Josephus in book 20.
Do you have it in front of you to read it?
I can pull it up. It'll take me a couple minutes, but
well, basically,
while we're on that, we've had a question come in for Harry. It's from a lady called Isra, and it's, why do you not question Paul's suffering according to Paul, but you doubt Paul's saying that Jesus appeared to Peter, the 500, the disciples, also according to Paul? What's the difference?
Thanks, Isra. Great question. And I love this kind of thing because I have to think on my feet. So I think I would make a few points. So the first thing that comes to mind is suffering. We know that people suffer. That's certainly a very, very normal claim. It doesn't strike me as odd, given that Paul is when you read his letters, he can be rather strikingly almost angry in his tone sometimes. He's very kind of contentious as an individual. Every single piece of evidence that we have suggests that he argued a lot and almost set out his entire life to argue with people. When you argue with people in a first century context where people hold very strong views about things, where the Romans weren't necessarily too concerned about mobs unless they got out of hand, they weren't necessarily all about law and order. I do think, and sometimes they stirred them up, I don't think it's at all unreasonable to say that Paul suffered. I think that is undeniably true. When Paul says that Jesus appeared to Cephas, firstly, note that Paul says that Jesus appeared to him, and we know that that was not in the body, or at least it wasn't within the period of time that Jesus was around, kind of the 40 days, when it seems like he had a kind of a physical form by eating fish, bread, and all of this again is granting the narrative. I would be very keen to delve into all of these stories, but it's a very different kind of claim, and it is one where he says, I hear that, so I received something, and we could concede maybe this does come from James, maybe it does come from Peter, possibly. It doesn't say necessarily that that's the case, but I could imagine that. That's not unreasonable to me, and I'm always willing to make concessions, and hopefully I'll get a few back. We'll see. But
cool.
But ultimately, it's a case of, I heard that Jesus appeared to Peter. Okay, maybe that is, and I do think that it's very obvious that Peter went around, to me at least, claiming that he had an appearance of the risen Jesus. But the question is whether this was a physical, event, or whether it was a visionary experience, and whether this is down to post-traumatic or bereavement. I'm trying to think of a word. Hallucination has a lot of kind of negativity around it, and that's why I avoid the term. I would say more kind of visionary experience. I think we have a lot of documented psychological research on this. So it's a case of appearances. Are they physical? Are they not? We don't have a lot of evidence in 1 Corinthians 15 to necessarily go by. But I hope that answers your question, Isra. I'm trying my best.
Thanks,
I know people will think, because I can see in the chat, some people will think I'm deliberately avoiding topics, maybe, but it's no. You talk and you forget things.
No problem.
But
Thanks, Harry.
Helps.
Thanks for that. Jonathan, do you want to carry on just with the point you were going to make, just regarding, is it Josephus you were going to mention? And then we've got another question come in that's along the sort of the Paul, so I'll ask that as well.
I just want to address first what Harry just said concerning physical versus spiritual vision, which is, I've got a number of responses to that. First, one objection that often comes up in relation to 1 Corinthians 15 is that Paul doesn't distinguish between his own experience and the other apostles. And so how do we know that there's a qualitative difference between that? And how do we know that the appearances that he's describing in 1 Corinthians 15 are actually physical sightings rather than visionary experiences? because Paul's experience was obviously qualitatively different from that of the other apostles, at least going by the account in Acts chapter 9. And my response to that is to point to the book of Acts, because Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. I don't know whether opponents agree with that. Paul's shaking his head no, but the evidence is overwhelming for that. And since Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, then then it would be very surprising if Luke and Paul did not share the same view on the resurrection. If Paul thought it was visionary experiences, whereas Luke clearly very explicitly talks about the physicality of the resurrection experiences. I think that would be very surprising if Paul took a visionary view on the resurrection appearances. In terms of the idea of hallucination, or whatever you want to call it, of the apostles as an explanation for the appearances, I think there's a number of lines of evidence against that. One is the polymodal or multisensory nature of the resurrection experiences. They involve not just sight, but other sensory modes, including physical contact with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus, and
in which, sorry, I just want to clarify this, if that's okay.
Mhm.
In which sources do we have the polymodal?
In the Gospels and Acts.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in the first source, we have none of that.
Well,
in 1 Corinthians 15, we could conjecture, we could read in from perhaps our beliefs around other sources, but it's not stated entirely, certainly.
Not entirely, because there's the appearance of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15, and also the appearance of the 12, which suggests a group sighting. But the Gospels and Acts are grounded in reliable eyewitness.
Just the 12 and the 500, does it indicate any sensory perception here?
In 1 Corinthians 15, not explicitly, no, but you can derive that from the Gospels and Acts. And Luke with the traveling companion.
But I don't want to work that way about like kind of reading into a source that which someone else has said without kind of, especially just, I don't feel comfortable with that historical approach. I don't think it's right that you should say, oh, well, Paul says, or so on. It can just be inferred, Paul left this out, it can be inferred from other sources that came 40 years afterwards.
Max, why don't you come back on that?
Yeah, no, I think all I was just going to say was one very brief thing, because, Harry asked the fair question, does 1 Corinthians 15 indicate a mode of perception? And I was just going to say, vision at least, in the sense that the verb is ophthe in Greek, which is the passive form of the verb horao, which is to see. So I think we can say minimally 1 Corinthians 15 implies vision.
I'm not going to, I could go up onto Strong's and try and look up the Greek, and but that would be a kind of for the audience to do. I'll generously accept that. I can't look it up and I can't confirm it.
Yeah, Jonathan, did you want to just finish off that point, and then we're going to move on to another question? So.
Max is absolutely correct that ophthe refers to sightings, physical sightings, not to visions. But in terms of sensory perception, in terms of physical contact and so forth, and Jesus speaking with the disciples, that's not explicitly there in 1 Corinthians 15, although the group sightings are suggested quite strongly, I think, in 1 Corinthians 15. But so the point I was making then is that Luke is very clearly a traveling companion of Paul. Paul himself tells us that in Colossians. Luke himself tells us that in Acts 16 and following. And there's evidence upon evidence that very forcefully shows that, I think. In terms
right,
of
except that I don't even think that Paul wrote Colossians, so you're talking
about... then the evidence is just overwhelming for that, so...
No,
I'm joining Paul here.
No, so like the trouble is we wanted to talk about what do we agree on. I think that I would say there's 6 or 7 letters that were written by Paul, and the rest of the New Testament, I got no idea. So when you're appealing to something like the book of Luke or the book of Acts, supports this, I'm kind of saying, well, that doesn't feel like evidence to me.
Okay.
That's part of the story. That's why I brought up the Spider-Man thing. It's like, oh, you're saying Spider-Man doesn't exist, but look, he worked at a newspaper. And it's like,
I don't think that the case for Luke being the traveling companion of Paul doesn't rest on Paul and authorship of Colossians.
No, but I don't like the fact that that Luke specifically as a person was named to be the author of Luke and Acts, was a much later decision.
It
So,
doesn't.
like,
Yeah, I think it's purely the internal evidence that establishes it.
Yeah.
Actually,
no,
So-
there's we
I mean-
passages, but that does not say it's Luke.
Well, actually, it does. So if you let me show you, for example, if you go to Acts 16, you have the introduction of the we passages, and they actually trail off when they pass through Philippi. If you go to Acts 20, so between when they trail off in Acts 16 and into Acts 20, you don't have any more of the we pronouns. However, in Acts chapter 20, when they pass through Philippi again, then the we passages are again introduced, which is very consistent with the hypothesis that the author of Luke Acts had stayed behind in Philippi and then rejoined Paul when he again passed through Philippi. So Craig Keener makes that point, for example, in his commentary on the Book of Acts. And we've also got various lines of internal evidence which are very consistent with Luke being a traveling companion of Paul. James Smith, for example, wrote a book on the voyage and shipwreck of St. Paul, where he points out various lines of evidence for Luke's presence on the voyage in Acts 27 with Paul, where Luke actually claims to be present there. It says, when it was decided that we should set sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. And then they start from Jerusalem, they go to Caesarea, and then to Sidon, and then to Myra, and then they get transferred to this Greek Alexandrian grain ship, and then they end up so the Roman centurion transfers these prisoners to one of these Alexandrian grain ships, and they end up at Crete. Just to give you a taste of the authenticity of the voyage, where Luke and Paul are together, let me just give you two evidences. There's other evidences as well, but from here at Crete, they're trying to...
Go ahead.
What?
I was just wondering if we wanted to go down this road.
It's significant for my argument. So, okay. So they're trying to get from one end of the island to the other in Crete, and so they sail along Crete, close to the shore. We read in verse 13-14, and then as soon as tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land, this is actually a well-confirmed wind that rides over Crete from the northeast, and it's strongest at this exact time near the Passover. Now, what's impressive is that, so they in verse 16 it says, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. Now, what's impressive is that the island of Cauda is more than 20 miles west-southwest of where the storm likely struck the travelers in the Bay of Basara. And this is precisely where the trajectory of a northeaster should have carried them. And it's not the sort of information that someone would have inferred without having been blown there. In fact, ancients found it nearly impossible to properly locate islands that were this far out. In fact, Ptolemy and Pliny the Elder had the estimates in Luke's day and would have been thought at the time to debunk Luke's claim here, because they differ from Luke's location of the island. But it's Luke's report alone that actually gets the implied location of the island right. And so that, together with an avalanche of other evidence, I think points forcefully to the conclusion that Luke really was a traveling companion of Paul. In fact, Colin Hemer, a commentator on Acts, says in his book, The Book of Acts and Studying Hellenistic History, he says it becomes increasingly difficult to believe that such details could have been derived from any kind of contemporary reference work. So the evidence for Luke being a traveling companion of Paul is very strong, and so then that gives... So if Luke's view of the resurrection is that it involved these polymodal experiences, that it was a physical sighting, and Paul's view was that it was some sort of visionary thing, that would be very, very surprising given their traveling companionship.
I don't want to get into big thing on authorship. I'd love to talk to you another day about that, Jonathan, because we're here to talk about the resurrection. I would just say that if someone in the audience wants to look up a lot of, just Google and look for scholarship on ways that the Book of Acts disagrees with Paul and his letters, there's plenty of things on both sides. I would, outside of evangelical scholarship, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the authors of those books is highly dubious. Outside of evangelical scholarship.
Can I just jump in there? I mean, I think, in terms of the actual names that are attached to them, I think Paul's correct that it is highly contested. But I think the thing that's unique in this case, perhaps, is that the name Luke is actually irrelevant, really. The point is that the author, whatever his name was, there's very strong evidence from the sorts of highly detailed verisimilitude and so on that Jonathan has just given one example of, that it's extremely unlikely that this sort of stuff could have been written by someone who wasn't traveling with
Well,
Paul.
or as Luke says, he compiled evidence. He used lots of sources.
Well,
The
so
author,
why does he use the we pronoun though?
because one very strong hypothesis is that the source he was using for those sections was a companion. Like if you're compiling as he says in my former book Theophilus, I wrote all of Jesus Can Do and Teach. It's
so yeah. I mean,
if I may, just one point just to add here, that so there are other hypotheses as well. So, for example, Ehrman, that I'm sure everyone knows, but I'm trying to hold up a book, but the background isn't showing it, but would hold that Acts Luke is actually a forgery in his name, and so the we passages are kind of meant to throw them off the descent. There's a lot of other hypotheses out there, and I do recommend, I actually listened in preparation to Jonathan's talk around this. I think it's very interesting, and again, I'm not particularly hung up on these things. I don't think Paul is necessarily either, although I acknowledge, Jonathan, that you regard this as quite important to your argument. But as we said, Luke used Mark as a source. When he did so, a lot of the time he copies the language word for word. I don't think it's necessarily implausible that Luke is using a source that has we and then is importing that wholesale into the narrative. I think that there is a lot of scholarship on this issue. I would recommend that people listen to Jonathan's talk on YouTube. It was interesting to me, but there is equally alternative hypotheses out there that we just don't have the time to go into, I don't think.
Is it worth us talking a bit about burial and empty tomb now?
I was actually just about to suggest that, Max. Yes. So I think, guys, we're going to move now on to, obviously, this whole conversation is looking at the resurrection. Is it fact or fiction? And we've had a little look just now as to some of the authors. Let's now look into some of the bits of evidence from your side. Max, do you want to start off from your angle on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try and be as brief as possible so that we can keep this interactive. So, I mean, I'll just say a couple of things about the burial and then the empty tomb. So, yeah, I mean, I think the burial, I mean, the first thing to say is the attestation of it is early. It's attested in that summary in 1 Corinthians 15. I mean, the other thing is that there is multiple attestation in this sense. Even if you say the four Gospels are not independent of one another, Paul and the Gospels is very widely agreed are independent in the sense that a Pauline letter collection would not have been available by the time that the Gospels were written. And so the Gospels independently attest the burial of Jesus. But then I think I'll just make two more points on the burial. So the archaeology, so I think this is worth talking about. So James Charlesworth, in this, again, I would hold up the book, but it'll blur it out. I think this very significant volume, Jesus and Archaeology, puts together a whole bunch of archaeologists on the New Testament, various essays. There's an essay on the burial site of Jesus. And according to Charlesworth, it is the majority view that the site at the Holy Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, the majority view among archaeologists is that it is the site where Jesus was buried. There's a few reasons for that. One of them is that the site is is inside the city, the expanded city walls. So Herod Agrippa in 44 AD, something like that, expanded the city walls of Jerusalem, and the site, the alleged site of Jesus' tomb, is inside that. And the point here is quite simple. No one who came along after those walls were expanded would make up a site within the city walls. The only way you would say it was there is if that site was outside the former city walls. And so that tradition must go back to within 10 or so years of the crucifixion. But also the site fits with archaeology. It appears to have been a first century quarry. It's near the garden gate, the implication of John's gospel that it was in a garden. And there are indeed first century tombs in the vicinity. But then in terms of the background, and this is probably where there's, I expect, going to be the most disagreement between ourselves and Harry and Paul, I think, is in terms of this claim about the background probability. So I think Harry was wanting to say that it's highly improbable, just in, you know, without looking at the specific evidence for what happened to Jesus, that there would have been a proper burial. I think, I mean, one issue is that when you look at lots of examples of crucifixion narratives from around the empire, it's not totally clear how relevant those are. It seems to me the more relevant evidence is of what happened to people in Roman Palestine specifically. And there we do have some quite clear evidence that suggests that sometimes people were given proper burials.
Right,
in fact,
sometimes.
Well, in fact, Josephus, who's I would say our best source on life in Roman Palestine, indicates that it was the norm in peacetime. So I'll just read to you from, this is very brief, from the Jewish War, Book 2, Section 220. So it says, the Roman governors who succeeded Agrippa, by abstaining from all interference with the customs of the country, kept the nation at peace. So that's important. So Josephus is saying there, the Roman procurators, in general, tried to keep peace with the locals by respecting their customs. And then
sorry, can I just interrupt? Did Pilate?
Well, Pilate backed down so Pilate, I mean, had a complicated relationship with the people, but he backed down when he tried to put his standards in the temple. But then Josephus goes on to say that the Jews are so careful about burial rites that even malefactors, criminals who have been sentenced to crucifixion, are taken down and buried before sunset. And I think it's also worth mentioning, as you guys will be familiar with this, but the heel bone of Yehohanan, first century crucifixion victim with a nail through the heel bone in an ossuary. So he was clearly given a proper burial. Now we can argue about the significance of, well, we've only found one of these, but I think, I mean, Dale Allison, historical Jesus scholar, makes the point, it's actually lucky that we even have this one, because normally, I mean, for one thing, often they would have tied up crucifixion victims with ropes, so we'd have had no record. We would have no way of knowing in that case that this was a crucifixion victim. But also the Romans, it was just a fluke that the nail got left in this time. And so I think all that to say, I mean, the claim that, I mean, someone like Bart Ehrman has tried to make recently, that it's just highly out of the ordinary for someone to be buried after crucifixion, just goes against the best sources we have for the particular time and place. And John Dominic Crossan really makes heavy use of the references to mass graves and mass crucifixions, but that, of course, is in the Jewish War, and so it's not really it's not very good evidence, because Jesus, of course, was crucified in peacetime. And again, Josephus emphasizes that he's talking about the situation before the Jewish War, that criminals would ordinarily have been buried and taken down before
But even
sunset.
Philo, for example, he made a big deal when he was talking about, and I'm sure you're familiar with his section.
Yeah.
He was talking about, that let's grant the people proper burial because it was the emperor's birthday, which tells me that can't always have been the case. Like, if we're making a special exception for the emperor's birthday, let's let them bury people properly. I think we would all agree that sometimes they were buried properly.
Yeah.
And sometimes they weren't. Even I've heard you say before that obviously.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But sorry, go on.
I mean, all I want to say is that it's not. So we have no idea. So sometimes they were buried one way, sometimes they weren't, and the attestations are in the Gospels, which I'm not.
Well, here's the broader point though. Suppose it's 10% of the time that a crucified Jew in Judea was buried properly. I mean, the implication of Josephus' text is actually that it's more than that, maybe even 50% of the time. And here's the thing, even if it's as low as 5%, it's actually very easy. That's not an astronomically low probability. It's quite easy. I mean, if you say, look, someone gets struck by lightning only 1 in a million times, well, it's not very easy to overcome that background probability with a bit of testimony. It doesn't even have to be awesome testimony. I think that's the only point I would make there.
Right, and I guess my point is not that it's implausible that he was buried properly. I don't think that's implausible at all. It's entirely plausible. But the historians like Habermas and Lacona concur that it's probably closer to those smaller numbers you're using than the bigger numbers you're using. So why should we automatically be granting this tomb story when it's not the most probable thing?
Well, so I think, like, let me put it this way. If we had nothing to go on but the general frequencies, I think I would agree with you that we should be somewhat agnostic about whether Jesus was buried. But given that we have background evidence that suggests maybe a middling probability or maybe somewhat low, but not astronomically low, conjoined with specific evidence for what happened in this case, then that's when it becomes sufficient, I would say.
But the specific evidence you have in this case is only the four Gospels.
No, 1 Corinthians 15.
No, 1 Corinthians 15 said he was buried. And the Greek word there is used from everything from potter's fields to the elaborate tomb. So that Greek word doesn't tell us,
But we've got a
sorry,
question.
the archaeological evidence as well that I mentioned. But yeah.
Can I jump in? Sorry, I know you want a question.
It's a question linked to this. It's a question linked to this one, Harry. It's one specifically asked you guys. It's Jewish burial practices were extremely different to non-Jewish burial practices, and they were extremely different in peacetime and war. So of the 100 that you've mentioned, you've looked into crucifixion accounts that you've mentioned, how many of them were in Israel before the Jewish-Roman war? And if there were, and if any of them were, then could you cite some examples that you've read about? Someone's just asked.
So the one, I guess I'll make my points first around a lot of this discussion won't have time to go into lots of detail. So I'd like almost to signpost like to Jonathan's talk, for example, if you're interested in the authorship of Luke from an evangelical perspective. If you're interested in the debate concerning burial and Josephus, Bart Ehrman has got a back and forth dialogue and a heck of a lot of material on his blog, a good amount of which is not behind a paywall, and the paywall goes to charity. It's a very, very small amount. I recommend it highly if you're interested. But in terms of addressing that very specific quote, and I would highlight this is absolutely firstly, Josephus is a source, like many others, and there are scholars of Josephus, and they would have their own comments on this passage that has been referred to. In terms of the one individual that we have, I would just like to just make a couple of points around Yohanan ben Hagkol, the individual who we've uncovered archaeologically with a nail through his foot. It's interesting to ask ourselves, why was this individual perhaps given a burial, and to conjecture reasonably as archaeologists would. So some things I'd point out is that he was very clearly wealthy and well connected. His ossuary lay right next to that of Simon, the builder of the temple. That was kind of the inscription on that ossuary. He died young, so we could imagine he was passionate enough to be swept up in a radical political cause, perhaps like Jesus. And he exhibited no evidence of disease, trauma. He had good teeth. There's a number of factors that show that this is a outlier, that this is an extraordinary individual. He was granted a merciful quick death because if you recall from the Gospels, sometimes the legs were broken of people to speed up their death. There were a number of kind of indicating factors that this is a real exception to the rule. My sources are publicly available on my blog, and of course I'll plug for that on the Book of Amos. I've got a two-part series. The other two parts are going to be the more contentious parts around the more specifics around Jesus, but the first two parts are making the points around burial practices and whether or not this was common material. So I would refer you to the Book of Amos on that point. But in the main, when you're looking at texts, it is important to narrow down. I agree with Max. Bearing in mind here, though, that it is the Romans that ultimately decided what was going on and what was not going on. Pilate was a particularly brutal governor. There's no question about that. The sources agree. You can read, if you trust Josephus so much, You can read his rather brutal exploits, and it was ultimately a matter of Roman practice whether or not they were going to abide. And even as well, I've mentioned that there are some biblical examples when it comes, and biblical precedent as well, when it comes to burial of crucifixion victims. You have, for example, let me just find, if you look at, for example, when David crucifies the, trying to remember now off the top of my head, two of Rizpah's sons, and the individuals were left up for 5 months for the scavenging birds. Burial practices among Jews, there's an element to which it's relevant, and there's an element of which it's not particularly relevant, because ultimately it's the Romans that are that we're talking about here, and whether or not they would be willing to grant an exception for someone who was very clearly an enemy of the state, which, yeah, I just can't believe. And if you want to look into the reasons why, Ehrman is a good source, myself, my blog, you can look at the sources yourself. There's a spreadsheet that detail all of them, which will make it handy for you.
Are you aware, Harry, of what Jeff Lauder, atheist philosopher, has written on this subject? So Jeff Lauder is an atheist philosopher, and he contributed a chapter to the book The Empty Tomb, Jesus Beyond the Grave. And he argues actually for the veracity of the burial account. So he says, since Judah was not, so I'm quoting from him, he says, since Judah was not in open rebellion against Rome at the time of Jesus' death, and since Jesus was apparently crucified as part of a small crucifixion, the Romans would have had no need for the deterrent provided by non-burial. Moreover, Jesus died right before a Jewish holy day. It is highly likely that the Romans would have been respectful of Jewish law regarding burial of executed criminals before Passover, especially since they would avoid unrest among the large numbers of visitors for the festival. Finally, like Craig, I think the role of Joseph of Arimathea in the story of Jesus' burial is much more likely on the assumption of a historical burial than on the non-burial hypothesis. Therefore, the burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea has a high final probability. And he's an atheist philosopher.
Atheist philosophers, they disagree. We're not all of one mind. Paul and I have some agreement and some disagreement.
Oh, that was me. I thought you guys were all of one mind.
Yeah.
No.
That's why you've got 2 skeptics, not just one.
I jest.
Yeah. But
which also seems to fly in the face that they would put guards in front of the tomb. Like, that's just really weird.
Yeah.
But the point is that we agree with Lauder's reasoning on this point, and I'm just pointing out that it's not just us as evangelical Christians saying this, but there's the atheists that will argue in a similar way as well. Now, at one point I did want to get to is a lot of scholars have pointed out some parallels between the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, and the book of Acts in chapter 13, where Paul and Barnabas are at Antioch in Pisidia.
Right, but that's written 20 years later. It makes sense that you would, the same oral traditions, feed all that stuff. Like similarities out of the same oral tradition aren't that impressive.
I don't think the book of Acts is 20 years after 1 Corinthians. But,
I'd also just, I would like to go back to the empty tomb, and I know this is my topic. But
finish the point first.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me just finish the point. So in Acts 13, it says, though they found in him no guilt worthy of death, they asked Pilate to have him executed. So as 1 Corinthians 15 says, he died, and when they had carried out all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb, that he was buried. Verse 30, but God raised him from the dead, so he was raised, and for many days he appeared to those who had come up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. And so there's some quite striking structural similarities between that creed in 1 Corinthians 15 and this text in Acts 13, which some scholars take to indicate that this goes back to an earlier source,
including Bar Ehrman.
And that indicates, and here it clearly says they laid him in a tomb, which is a tomb burial, not a
right. I think we would agree that the oral tradition extends far, far further back than what we have written. I mean, I think that's that's obvious. May I also say how excited I am that everyone else says buried, like I do. The Americans get on my back so hard when I say buried. So thank you, everyone, for affirming me.
Just in terms of the empty tomb, you mentioned, and I think there's two different ways, and this is, you know, a classic of history that you could interpret, the deterrent effect, whether or not Romans would be willing at Passover. They don't want to disturb anyone. They don't want to, you know, whip up riots. Or you could say, this is a bloody good way, if you'll pardon my French, of actually, this is exactly the time when Romans would want the deterrent effect. You're getting crowds from all over the world congregating in Jerusalem. They are celebrating a feast where God throws off an imperial oppressor. And ultimately as well, there's a funny little account in one of the ones that I looked at where they actually crucify lions as a show to other lions that they shouldn't be savaging the cities. They assumed that the deterrent effect would be so strong that they even crucified lions to this effect to try and frighten the other lions away. And the reason I make this point is there are different ways that you can see this, and I think it's far more likely that this is exactly the time when they would crucify someone and when they would be least willing to grant any concessions. Passover is, you know, quite clearly the time that would be the highest risk of riots.
I mean, I think it bears mentioning on this point as well that, I mean, it's not just the Gospels, but also Josephus says that Jesus' crucifixion occurred by Roman authority ultimately, but at the instigation of the Jewish leadership. And I think that that's another reason for thinking that the Romans would be likely to respect Jewish scruples over burial customs. I mean, in addition to the fact that Josephus quite clearly says that ordinarily in peacetime that the Romans did respect Jewish burial customs.
Josephus is not a Josephus is an interesting source because you mention the name Josephus and you just kind of have this impression of a guy sitting around in you know, in Jerusalem or in Galilee writing, and he's a, you know, a Jewish author and talks about Jewish things. He, in as much as he is a Jewish author, he is also, in many respects, you can regard him as a Roman author. And he's, you know, asked to chronicle the Jewish war, for example. He clearly has a good relationship with the Romans because he manages to ask for, and this is one of the interesting, you know, times when he requested that he be given the body of one of he notes some of his friends, one of which had expired on the cross, and he took down one of the others. But he has a very special relationship with the Romans, and he is keen to make them, in some respects, look as good as possible. He's a bit of an apologist for them in some ways, and yeah, I mean, I don't think you can take him as a necessarily a unbiased, perfect source. That's not the way ancient historians do their work. And as I say, Ehrman has quite a strong rebuttal to be examined for those interested in the topic. Because I know. Well, I mean,
Ehrman's case really just rests on the same sorts of things that you've pointed to in terms of trying to claim that sources on crucifixion generally paint the situation as there being no burial, but he conveniently doesn't really deal with the more direct evidence concerning what happened in Roman Palestine specifically.
He does. I would direct you to.
No, I've read what he says on this. Yeah.
Max, we had some agreement. We had that sometimes they were buried properly, and
right.
Sometimes
no, I think we agree on that. Yeah. Yeah. And I suspect that you and I are in slightly closer agreement than me and Harry on that point, Paul, because I think you're more willing to say sometimes yes, sometimes no, and I think I'm fine with saying, as a matter of, you know, the background probability. It's, if that's all we had to go on, that wouldn't be great. Right. But I've also suggested other reasons besides.
Well, and you suggest, like, for example, the Holy Sepulchre, which for me, like, that was Constantine's mom came to town
Well, I didn't mention anything to do with his.
No, I know you didn't, but she is the source of all.
Well, I didn't. No, I don't think anything I said about that relied on that. So the argument was just that the site that is marked by the Holy Sepulchre Church is inside Herod Agrippa's expanded walls. The point being, no one who came along after the expansion of those walls in 44 AD would make up that site. The only way you would have someone claiming that site is if they knew of the site's location before the expansion.
Well, or if they knew that this is where people were buried, and they later built the Temple of Venus on top of it. And when she comes around looking for a place to, like the idea that in the 4th century that people couldn't be making up these details, and that perhaps they weren't even aware of like how it fit with the Bible, that seems implausible to me.
Well, here's the problem with that. So by the time it's got the Temple of Venus on it, it's unrecognizable. There's no way you would have guessed that there were 1st century Arcosolia tombs under there. So the point is, at a point in time when the argument that I was making was a combination of the fact that the site has features that fit extremely well with the Gospels, combined with the fact that someone would not have made up that location after the expansion of the walls, because everyone knows crucifixions happen outside the city walls.
But again, that, if I'm willing to say that the creed a couple years later could be a legend, 10 years later, that someone within the first 10 years, someone said, oh, where's the site? Let's pick there. Also doesn't seem that implausible to me.
Well, so I think that to be fair, that argument from the archaeology, I think, establishes that the site was claimed within a very few years. I mean, if you're going to kind of press your kind of extreme skepticism about how easily the Christians could make up stuff within an extremely short space of time, I can't rule that out just based on this argument. But if you're I take as a success for this argument if you're willing to grant that it shows that within like 10 years of the events that this was claimed as the site.
Okay, then have a success.
Thanks.
Guys, we're going to move on to another point. Max, Jonathan, do you have another point that the guys Paul and Harry can come back to? Jonathan, do you have one? And then we're going to go for another question.
Sure. Let's see. I'll talk about.
We've got another 10 minutes left, so if you could,
I could share additional evidence for the empty tomb, or we could go to another question. Maybe do you want to prioritize questions, or?
We've got a number of questions. We've got 13 questions that have come in. Some relating to the tomb, some relating to a number of different aspects. So, do you want to
do some questions? If I may.
Some questions,
because otherwise it's unfair on all these people who bothered to listen to us.
So one person, Simon, has asked in: if you accept Paul's words, how do you account for his conversion? What changed his mind? I don't know. Maybe
who's
Harry
that meant
Paul,
for? Do you think? Who do you think that's?
I think it's probably meant for Paul and Harry.
For me, it makes we're being asked in a lot of ways to psychoanalyze historical figures. We're being asked by one side to say they must have been very, very genuine. That's the only thing to explain it, which is a psychoanalysis. As well, you can psychoanalysis and say, well, Paul, who was potentially out there, if we believe his words, out there murdering, at least issuing murderous threats, if not actually murdering people. We know that people who do extreme things, that their conscience can weigh on them and they can flip, that they can break. There's PTSD. These are well-known things that can happen to a psyche, that you suddenly come to regret the things that you've done, and that some of those things can relate to visions. So I actually accept that at some point, it's very plausible, I'm not hanging my hat on it, it's very plausible that Paul had a psychological break, regretted what he was doing. Part of that is a manifestation of in his head a vision, and that he very sincerely fought on the side of, for Christianity after that. That's one very plausible explanation to me.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that, or would agree with Paul?
I'll be quick and agree with Paul. I think that is a highly evidenced phenomena that exists in the psychological literature that people should go away and read and judge for themselves. But when we examine Paul, and Paul is great because we have so much of his life through all of the different letters that we can kind of just piece together a bit of a sense of who he was and what his character was. He writes, so, either he's, partially sighted, when he writes in big letters in his own hand, or has a shaky hand. He goes blind with this experience. He has visions of a man of Macedonia. He has this experience on the road to Damascus. And afterwards he's kind of blinded by it. There's a lot going on with Paul. Paul is a very interesting psychological character to try and psychoanalyze. And you can come up with as many theories as there are scholars of the New Testament.
Great, thanks, Harry. Great. One of our next questions is, here we go. This is to all, I think, and maybe some can have a comment on this. Aside from the Bible, do any of the panelists agree with any other religious text or historians' writings and their opinions of Jesus' resurrection, specifically the Quran, the Hadiths, and is it sufficient evidence to support their view? Where do each of you get your facts from or rely on?
Can I just jump in? I know I just answered, but the Quran, and again, go away, look up these things for yourself, but they're terrible sources for the life of Jesus. I think we will all agree on that.
We can agree on that.
Yeah, and also sorry, go ahead.
One thing that you can note, for example, about them is their, in my view, quite clear dependency upon the infancy gospels of Jesus, and the stories that are contained within there are very, very, very similar and near identical to the ones that you get about Jesus in the Islamic faith. And you don't usually get this with the Quran. You don't get an indication of the source material, and I think there were sources that sat behind the Quran that we no longer have. But I think the infancy gospels is one of them, and we know that the infancy gospels are not great sources.
Yeah, and also the Quran explicitly in Surah 4, verse 157 denies the crucifixion of Jesus, and I would argue that that is derivative from Docetic Gnostic sources, because the Docetic Gnostics didn't believe that Jesus was physically incarnated. That's why John in his epistle says that if anyone says that the Christ is not come in the flesh, is of the Antichrist. So some of the Docetic Gnostics didn't believe that Jesus was fully crucified. He only appeared to be crucified because you can't crucify a ghost. And so that's why I think the Quran says that he wasn't crucified, but they were deluded by resemblance, or only appeared that he was crucified.
I wish that the Quran had been silent on Jesus, because then I would never have to hear the phrase swoon theory ever again in my whole life.
Yeah, no, it's one of those. We've got a question for you, Paul. If most of the 12 disappeared from history, what do you make of the claim that Thomas, one of the original disciples, supposedly took the gospel to the risen Christ, or of the risen Christ, to India?
Thomas going to India. Thomas is also, if you depend on sources, he goes elsewhere as well. So I don't buy it. They're 5th century. I believe that particular one is 5th century. I would recommend that everyone read Sean McDowell's recent huge book on the martyrdom of the apostles, who goes into all these. And Sean McDowell completely agrees with me that the Thomas story is highly dubious.
He's also a Christian and did his PhD thesis on this very topic.
He vociferously defends the resurrection of Jesus, but he agrees that most of these apocryphal stories there's not much to them. And it was his PhD.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Paul. We've got a question here for Harry and someone else as well. Do you believe Julius Caesar was the same emperor we know according to historical evidence? Why doubt Jesus' resurrection, but not other less backed up historical facts?
Well, there's an assumption in the question, less backed up historical facts. But I would say that I am generally quite skeptical of ancient history. Our sources are not great. And you have to do, generally the skill set of an ancient historian is taking not much, very poor quality sources, and then trying to work out what the heck happened. The job of a modern historian is very different. You've got too many sources for like World War II. You've got thousands of letters. Where do you even begin? And then trying to work it all out. It's a very, very different job. If you go to any historian of Tacitus, Pliny, you are talking about people who are generally actually quite skeptical of the sources, and feel free to, if you're really, really bored during the lockdown, go and have a look at some of their work. But they don't generally accept things on face value. But other claims as well, like, did Alexander the Great, some things we know about his life and other things we don't. We definitely have no idea how he died. The sources all completely disagree and they're very poor quality. But we do know that, broadly speaking, he conquered a heck of a lot of places. How do we know that? We have coinage. We have cities named after Alexandria, Alexandria in various parts of the world. You can piece together, based on, as Max says, a Bayesian probability framework. Yeah, that's my approach to ancient history. But I don't have a PhD in it.
Did anyone else want to ask anything or comment on that, Jonathan? No. Okay, thank you. That's something done. Cool, guys. Well, I think the other there's some very long questions, but we've got one question here that came in very early. I think maybe worth asking. Just as probably the last question before we close up, because we've gone on some time, but were any of the prophecies about Jesus' death and resurrection beyond the control of Jesus through his own actions?
The place he was born, for example, in Bethlehem, according to Micah 5. His death at the time of Passover is an interesting coincidence because of the theological import of the Passover significance. Jesus' death happens to coincide with the feast of Passover. In 1 Corinthians 5, Paul, of course, refers to Christ as the Passover lamb that's been slain for us, so therefore let us keep the feast. For Jesus to get himself crucified in the first place, if his motivation was simply to fulfill prophecy, that would be rather strange. The fact that so there's quite a lot, I think, there. We could go on for.
Hang on, just to ask a question. Sorry, you said if his aim was to get crucified. Sorry if I didn't hear correctly. Then if his aim was to fulfill prophecy, then going and getting himself crucified would be a strange way of doing that. Is that what you said?
Yeah, exactly.
Surely the whole point of your view of the Old Testament, as you would call it, would be that it points forwards to the crucifixion of a Messiah.
Yeah. But it seems very odd for someone to get themselves crucified, especially when crucifixion, according to Jewish law, to be hung on a tree was to be rendered under God's curse, literally a heretic. Deuteronomy 21:23. In fact, Trypho mocks Justin Martyr for believing in the crucified Messiah. Trypho was a Jewish rabbi, and the Romans mocked Christians for the belief in the crucified Messiah. And so it seems very strange that Jesus, if he was an imposter, would go to the trouble of getting himself crucified, especially because we have at least a dozen would-be messianic movements on the century and either side of Jesus, which routinely end with the death of the founder. And most of the Jews of the time of Jesus were expecting a military leader to overthrow the Roman occupiers and reestablish a Davidic reign. Another one that's kind of outside the control of Jesus is that Christianity becomes the worldwide global religion that it becomes, because according to various texts in the Old Testament, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 42, and various other places, Daniel 7, Zechariah 9, the part of the Messiah's job description is to bring representatives of all nations to a recognition of the God of Israel. That's on the hypothesis that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. That probability is very high because it's prophesied in the Old Testament. On the hypothesis that he's not the Messiah, the probability is far, far lower than that. And so I think it's strong Bayesian evidence that contributes to the cumulative case. We could talk about Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks, where it actually, I think, gives a time frame for the revealing of the Messiah. So there's various prophetic passages in the Old Testament which I think are not engineered on the part of Jesus. And the way that I frame the argument typically from messianic prophecy when dealing with atheists, I would deal with it differently if I was talking with an Orthodox Jew than I would with an atheist. The way I would argue with an atheist from messianic prophecy would be to say that the contending hypotheses are that a fulfillment or a match between the gospel portrayal of Jesus' life in the Old Testament is either the product of human design, divine design, or coincidence, and or that it didn't happen. And so I limit my argument to cases where we can be both confident that the event happened the way that the Gospels describe, and which are unlikely to be the product of human design or coincidence. So the example I gave, for example, of Jesus' death at the time of Passover, correlating with the feast of Passover and the theological import of that, about the sacrifice of the lamb and the smearing of the blood on the doorposts of every home, and so the angel of death would pass over the Israelite homes. That is something which is striking on the hypothesis of coincidence. I assigned in an article I wrote recently on this topic, I assigned a conservative Bayes factor of 50, which I think is quite conservative. It's also not, I think, so it's so it points to either the product of human design or divine design, but it's not human design because we know that Jesus really was crucified at the time of Passover, because of the historical evidence supporting that, and so therefore divine design is the best hypothesis. And I think you can make a good cumulative argument from numerous examples of that sort of phenomenon in the gospel accounts.
So there's one thing when we have these kind of debates and discussions about the nature of the gospels and what their sources are and things. One of the things I think a lot of people forget or ignore is that the Old Testament is actually a huge main source for the people who are writing the gospels. Matthew in particular, over and over again, says this was to fulfill this passage, and he quotes the passage from the Septuagint. Obviously, for me, so for example, the first example you gave up was born in Bethlehem. I don't think he was born in Bethlehem. I see Matthew and Luke both inventing two stories to why everyone knew was from Nazareth, how they ended up in Bethlehem. But so I mean, it's the thing you're ignoring is that the legend that has grew to match the prophecies. So we'd have to agree. So there's the one event that we do agree on, though. You listed it, that he died on the Passover. But it doesn't seem that weird to me that on the weekend that Jerusalem is most full of people, when everyone comes there, when that was the start of lots of movements, that the fact that he died during Passover week seems highly unremarkable when that is when the town is fullest. That is when most stuff is going on. Like, I understand that it can be religiously charged, but it also happens to be the time when most people are there,
Sure.
Therefore the most likely.
No, that's a fair point, and that's why I think I assigned quite a conservative Bayes factor of 50 rather than more than that. So I think that has to be taken into account when you're assigning a Bayes factor to that fact. Of course, relating to the resurrection, which is a discussion today, another significant correspondence is in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says that Christ was raised again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. And this also comes out in Jesus' conversation with the Emmaus disciples in Luke 24 as well. What does it mean for Christ to be raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures? Well, in the context of 1 Corinthians 15, he mentions that Christ is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. In other words, he's the guarantor, as it were, of the general resurrection to come of all the believers at the end of history. And when you go to Leviticus 23, we find that the Feast of First Fruits was to be celebrated the day following the first Sabbath following Passover, which would fall on the Sunday. And of course, the Pharisees and the Sadducees had a disagreement in that the Sadducees believed that corresponded to the first weekly Sabbath after Passover. The Pharisees, on the other hand, believed that it corresponded to the day of Passover itself as kind of a special Sabbath. But in the first century, of course, the Sadducees were in charge of the temple, and so their view prevailed. And so the Feast of First Fruits was commemorated by the Jewish people on the day following the first Sabbath after Passover, on which they fell the resurrection of Jesus. And so the fact that that's claimed, I think there's not conclusive evidence, but it contributes to the cumulative argument for the hypothesis of design, not coincidence, that they weren't honestly mistaken in their belief that Christ rose again on the third day, on the Sunday. But it's something that points to design, either on the part of the human author or on the part of God raising Jesus from the dead on that day for the theological import of that. But since scholars are virtually unanimous that Jesus was not, that the resurrection hypothesis, the resurrection claim was not a deliberate fictionalization on the part of the apostles, then, and there's good evidence for that, then I think it points to the divine design hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead on the Sunday in order to fulfill that theological symbolism.
and generally, you know, I like to have people look at it. I worked in the film industry, and I worked on sequels to films, and sequels to films are true to the original film, even though entirely different sets of people work on it, because, you know, continuity carrying forward is a thing. So you want to make sure that the new story matches details to the old story. That's not actually that remarkable.
Jonathan, did you want to say one last thing on that, and then we're gonna close things up?
Yeah, so that's my whole point, is that it points away from the claim of the resurrection happening on Sunday being something which that was a result of the apostles being honestly mistaken, and points towards design. Then we have to adjudicate, well, is it divine design or human design? And since there's independent reason to question the human design hypothesis, it therefore points to the divine design hypothesis. And we do have good evidence, aside from 1 Corinthians 15, that the earliest claim was that Christ rose from the dead on the Sunday. That they changed the day from the Saturday to the Sunday in terms of when the Christians were to meet, for example. And we can trace that back to quite early. And we have testimony in the New Testament to the celebration of the commemoration of the establishment, the institution of the Lord's Day, which is the Sunday in commemoration of Christ being raised on that day. But I'll finish with that.
Thank you, guys, for all your comments this evening. We're going to close the conversation there. We've had so many great questions in and had really a good conversation both sides. So I want to firstly thank you to all our guests who've joined us today, Paul, Harry, Max, and Jonathan. Thank you. I would encourage everyone, just as we are finishing off the show for today, if you could all check out and follow the Inside Story, Real Inside Story, which is on all channels. It would be great to see you guys on other conversations that we're going to be having on here as well. I'm also going to be uploading this YouTube video that will be on YouTube in a couple of days' time. It will be available, and all the links to all our guests' content will be on there as well. So we look forward to viewing that. If you do want to have any questions for us or any of the panelists, then please do put them through to info@theinsidestoryshow.show, and I will be able to pass them on as well. But in the meantime, I'd like to just thank our guests again. In a normal show, we would have clap at this time. That isn't possible today, but I'm sure all our guests all our viewers can show their respect in other ways by following some of the links and the channels from our guests as well. So without further ado, we're going to close off the show for today. It will be uploaded on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we've been discussing the evidence for the resurrection. Is it fact or fiction? The resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if you want to watch the whole conversation, then this will be on YouTube very shortly. So thanks again to all our guests, and we look forward to seeing you on a conversation